At dawn, a noose swung in the wind. Justice in the frontier came faster than sunrise. Out on the frontier, justice came quicker than sunrise. On the porch, a noose swung like the ghost of fate. Just a day before, Colt Hayes, a quiet rancher, had taken in a starving child. A bowl of beans and a worn photograph soon pulled both the Comanche and the town into one night where mercy could cost blood, and every choice cut deeper than steel. The cottonwood out front held the night like a black lung, drawing north wind through its ribs. From one crooked limb a hemp loop swung, creak, pause, creak, as if the tree were practicing justice before the light came. Llano dust hung in the air, a thin red film on the porch rail. Colter Hayes, folks called him Colt, stood at the porch edge and took the weather full in the face. Along the rim where the land fell away, points of fire showed and hid. Blue, the gray dog that had wandered in one day and never left, lay in the doorway with his chin on his paws. His ears told him what a man's eyes could only guess. Horses were out there, and men on them, drawing lines in the dark. Colt lifted the tin cup from the rail and felt the last of its heat. He drank what was left and set the cup down soft so the sound wouldn't travel. He reached inside the door and touched the tintype on the shelf, without looking. His thumb knew the faces. A woman with steady eyes, a boy whose hair wouldn't stay down, both circled by a ring of dried grass. He changed every Sunday. Beyond the cottonwood the land rose to the caprock, where the fires burned. Between one breath and the next, a sound rode down off the rim. Hoofbeats, close and careful, like somebody counting. They came a dozen and stopped, came a dozen more and stopped, and then the sound went out. Silence will lean on a man harder than noise. He thought of the little girl, asleep in his chair, small enough to drown in a blanket, beadwork at her throat catching lamplight. She had come to his water staggering, the way strays come when they're more bone than dog, and still have enough faith to drink. He fed her because the first law out here isn't printed, it's practiced. If something's dying in your yard, you help. Or you turn into the kind of man the wind forgets to touch. A gust shouldered through, set the noose turning a slow quarter, rope whispering against bark. Folks in town would say a hanging rope was only a warning, a way to keep order without using it. Folks say peaceful things in daylight. Blue lifted his head and fixed on the creek. Colt followed his eyes and saw the movement that wasn't wind. Horse bodies reshaped the dark, gliding into a wide arc. No yelling, no showing off. Just the slow drawing of a bow you couldn't see yet. The arc tightened and held. Colt took off his hat and ran a palm over the salt line at the crown. He rolled his shoulders once, like a man about to lift a load that isn't his but needs lifting. He looked at the tintype. Then, because some kinds of courage are borrowed from the dead. The glass threw his face back, a lean man past 30 with dust in his beard. He put the picture back and let his hand fall. "Tonight," he said to no one in particular and to the whole round world, "only one thing ain't allowed to shake." Down by the creek, the horses steadied. Somewhere to the left, a single hoof struck stone and went quiet. The line across the water eased into a clean crescent, its open end pointing at his door. Blue rose without a sound and stood forward by a half step. Colt set his hat low and reached for nothing. His hands hung open at his sides, palms turned the way a man shows he's brought no tricks. The night held. Across the creek, the crescent drew in, slow as a tide. Blue's throat found that small private note again, the one only a house and a man can hear. By noon, the caprock was throwing heat like a blacksmith's forge. The rim shimmered and the creek went to glass, a skim of light so bright a man had to squint to tell water from sky. Colt had his shirt sleeves rolled and a nail between his teeth, mending a post that a winter bull had shouldered loose. Sweat salted his eyes. The mesquite out there didn't move any. Even the flies worked slow, He set the new cedar in and tamped with his heel, wire biting the grain. When he lifted his head, he caught something that wasn't wind or cattle, just a stitch of motion in the far glare. Took him a breath to separate it from the mirage. Then he saw it plain. A small figure, all edges and wobble, walking with that zigzag step the thirsty have. Headed for his creek like a compass, was tied to her bones. He let the nail drop, raised both hands from habit, palms out. No rifle, no fast talk. Ain't much for show out here, and he wasn't much for talk either. He stood where she could see him long before he moved, so she could decide if a porch and a man were safe. She came on slow, dust in her hair, cloth torn to threads. Not a boy, a girl, 8, maybe 9, cheeks hollowed, lips split white. At her throat hung beadwork darkened by road dirt, the kind of careful pattern no poor hand makes for nothing. She looked at the creek first, then at him, then at the creek again like she was apologizing for wanting to live. Colt pointed at the water and stepped aside. She dropped to her knees and leaned long over the edge, not reckless, just near-addled with thirst. He knelt too and cupped a little upstream, let the water cool his wrists. When she'd had enough to bring her breath back, she sat back on her heels and put both hands to her belly, the oldest sign on earth. He nodded and pushed up, slow as a shadow, and said what men say when there ain't language to bridge. "Come on now." They crossed to the house at a steady drift. The porch boards knew his step. Blue thumped his tail once and let her pass, reading the law off Colt's face. Inside was shade and the steady tick of a fly in the window. He set her in his chair, the one that had worn a groove his size, then went to the stove and lifted the lid on the bean pot. The smell that rose was plain and good. Salt pork, onion, a little chili he'd traded for in Mobitier. He tore cornbread and set it near, laid a bent silver spoon on the table, the handle wavy from years of leaning in hot pots. She watched his hands like they were sun. When he slid the bowl over, she reached, stopped, looked up. He tipped his chin. She ate careful at first, then with a small animal's hunger, not sloppy, not greedy, just steady. He cut the bread small and pushed it in easy reach. He put a worn wool scarf around her shoulders because the sweat went cold fast in shade, and he'd seen folks shake themselves sick that way. Only when the tremble left her fingers did he see the beadwork proper. The colors hid under dust, but the pattern came through. River water blue set off with 2 black chevrons and a scarlet path between. He knew it because old Gus had jawed about it all winter, jawed like a man who'd spent more nights than he should have under other people's skies. "Greyhawk's house," Gus had said, scratching the map of it with a twig in the dirt. "Family beads, not trade. You see that red line? Means blood kept, not spilled. Don't mistake it." Colt's gaze went to the bust seam of her dress. A strip of cloth there had snagged and torn. He'd noticed something at the fence and had not thought. Now he stepped back out, crossed to the post he'd been setting, and found it where the prickly pear held it. A ribbon of ceremony cloth, the same river blue, threads pulled by spines. He eased it free, rolled it careful, and slid it into his pocket like a man putting away a letter. When he came back, she was peering at the shelf. The tintype sat there with its circle of dried grass. Her small hand hovered, then didn't touch. He picked the picture up and dusted the glass on his sleeve and set it where the lamplight could find it, then moved it back again because it was his, and because sometimes grief is a private pasture. Outside, the light got flatter, heat going from bright to white. The day itself felt wrong, the way a pony does before a storm you can't yet smell. He rinsed the spoon and set it back, bowl empty, bread gone. The scarf rode high on her collarbones. She lifted the beads once as if to show him something that words would fail, then let them fall against bone. "Reckon you're tired," he said. She didn't know the word, but her eyes answered yes. He tugged the blanket from the foot of his bed, shook the summer dust out, and tucked it around her where she curled in his chair like a field mouse finds its nest. Blue took the floor by her feet, big sigh, old dog doing old work. Colt stood a while with the weight of the room on his shoulders. He knew what the pattern meant. He knew what men would say if they saw her in his house and him with soft hands. He knew what the fire points on a ridge meant when they lit all at once. He also knew the first law he lived by and who had taught it to him. 2 faces in a frame, both gone, leaving him the keeping of it. He went out to finish that fence anyway because a man takes the next thing first. He cinched wire and set staples and heard, far off where the earth runs into sky, a horn that might have been a cow and might not have. He straightened, listening, and the land held its breath like a church. He touched the pocket where the blue ribbon lay and felt the prickle of the pear spines through denim. Sometimes doing the right thing is signing your name to trouble. The house held a cooled quiet that comes after heat has had its way. Flies clicked at the window like loose beads. The girl dozed and woke in small tides, the wool scarf high at her neck, one corner caught in the beadwork as if the two belonged. When she opened her eyes, she looked around in the cautious way hunger teaches, taking inventory of everything that might turn on you and everything that might not. The bowl on the table showed a brown ring where beans had been and now weren't. A slick of pork fat shone at the bottom like a thin moon. The bent silver spoon lay across the rim, handle cocked up, old scar of heatwork wavering it. Beside it, the torn heel of cornbread left crumbs the color of dust. A man could write a book about a life from what's left in a bowl. If a stranger had walked in, he'd have known someone had been fed and fed fair. Blue took the girl in with that old dog gaze that isn't begging and isn't pity, just a kind of counting. He shifted so his ribs made a soft ladder under her feet. She put a hand on his head without thinking. He took it like payment due and settled. Colt rinsed the cup and turned it down on the counter, a dull bell of tin. He'd washed dishes alone for a long time now. Another set there made the room red different. He set the spoon in a pan and, because he was that kind of man, wiped the table smooth with his hand, sweeping crumbs into his palm and into the stove mouth for the small satisfaction of an end. Her eyes went to the shelf again. The tintype stood there in its frame, the ring of dried blue stem around it crisp enough to break if you breathed wrong. Colt didn't mind people seeing it. He minded them staring. This child didn't stare. She looked and then looked away, then looked back the way thirsty people do with water. He lifted the picture down and stood with it a second, thumb at the corner. The glass had a fog to it no cloth could wipe out. The years get into things, but he rubbed it anyway, the way you keep polishing a memory long after it's bright as it will ever be. The woman in it had that morning plain look. The boy had trouble with stillness. You could tell even from a frozen second. The boy had been all knees and questions. Colt put the picture back where the lamplight could catch it when evening came. He'd replace the grass ring Sunday if Sunday came. The girl's hand rose and hovered. She didn't touch until she had permission, and the permission came when he nodded once, slow. Her fingers found the corner, not the face. She traced the edge like you test a fence wire to see if it'll hold. Then she looked up at him with a question that needed no words. He answered with the only thing he had that year that wasn't worn out. He took the scarf and snugged it better around her. The wool had pilled down to nubs. His mother would have turned it into wagon rags by now. Out here, you kept what warmed. He felt the weight of the blue ribbon in his pocket, the ceremonial strip he'd pulled off the prickly pear. The spines had gone through denim to skin, and he'd had to worry them out with the tip of his knife. He rolled the cloth tight and slipped it deeper, not to hide it so much as to keep it from harm. The way a man stores away a letter he can't read but knows is important. "Sleep if you can," he said, and she let her head find the chair back and went to that shallow half-sleep children use when they don't trust a room yet. Her breath steadied. Blues did too, paired like a team. On the wall, the minute hand of the old clock moved once, then thought better and stayed. The heat on the porch found a knot in the cottonwood and spoke through it in a slow groan. Colt stepped out and checked the sky without meaning to. Clouds had the flat look of hammerheads too far to mean anything yet. Heat shimmered off the caprock rim. He walked the fence line to the gate and back, not because it needed him, but because his legs had learned to walk when his mind was busy. When he came in, the girl had risen to look at the tintype again. She wasn't in his chair now, but standing close to the shelf, careful not to shadow it. He watched her lips move with the kind of prayer people say without thinking. Not a church prayer, just the words people put to the space between the living and the gone. "Thank you, forgive me, I'll try." He went to the stove, lifted the lid to make sure nothing was catching at the bottom of the bean pot, and set it back soft. He took the spoon up and put it down again, then felt foolish for not knowing what his hands ought to do. He poured a dipper of water and drank half and set the rest where she could see it if she woke. He opened the door because sweat and cooking make a still house heavy, and a lived-in house needs a breeze to keep from turning into a tomb. The day weakened by degrees. The straight light of noon slanted and got meaner. Shadows lengthened like men late for something. Colt stood at the threshold and combed the yard with his eyes the way you learn to, measuring what in it could be used for a stand and what would just catch a shin in a hurry. He looked at the cottonwood limb that held a scar from an old rope and felt the old, dumb anger a man feels at wood that has served as witness to things trees shouldn't see. Behind him the chair creaked small and then went still again. He listened for the girl's breathing and heard it, thin and even. Blue's tail drifted once across the floor like a broom. Outside a quail whistled and then hushed as if reminded. From a long way off, so far the sound traveled in and out of the land like a vein. You could hear a horn, not brass, not cavalry, but the old ranch cow horn kind, or maybe not ranch at all. The note stretched thin and went away, came back softer and died a second time. You could mistake a thing like that if you wanted to. A man out here didn't. Colt put his palm over his pocket and felt the rolled cloth and the dots of prick in his skin beneath it. He turned down the lamp to a wick thread so the room would read less full from the yard. Then he sat on the floor by the door with his back to the jam and listened to the prairie try to decide what it meant to say next. Late light slanted off the rim and turned the dust the color of old pennies. From the south, a smudge showed and lengthened, 3 horsemen pushing an easy lope that told you they'd talked on the way and made up their minds. Blue rose and stood without barking. Colts of wind rolled across the dooryard, carrying grit and that saddle soap smell men wear when they aim to be official. Hiram Tate came first, big in the shoulders, hat brim curled like a sneer. Behind him rode Deputy Asa Boone with his tin star clipped neat to his vest, and Reverend Silas Pritchard trying to keep the tail of his coat out of the cinch. Hiram pulled up hard enough to make his bay dance. The other 2 let their mounts stand and breathe. No one looked at the house long. Men raised out here know better than to stare at a man's door. "Frontier ain't a church, Hayes," Hiram said, voice already up a notch, like he wanted the cottonwood to hear it too. "You go feedin' strays that ain't yours. You buy the trouble they bring." Colt kept a hand on the jam. Inside, the child's breathing was shallow and even. The room behind him held the bean smell and the warm iron smell of a stove gone to coals. He didn't reach for a gun because he hadn't reached for one before, and because reaching now would say a thing he didn't mean. Deputy Asa settled his reins and looked past Colt at the yard, like he was reading the ground for what had already happened. He cleared his throat. Word out of town is Greyhawk's girl's gone. Scout's been running signs since yesterday. Folks say smoke went up at noon from the far bench. He kept it flat, not a threat in it, not a promise either. If she's here, it ain't a night for pride, Colt. It's a night for not getting folks killed. Reverend Silas touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat and let them fall. Son, he said. And you could tell he called half the county son, whether they were older or not. Some things abide. Charity's one. But there's a heat to men when a child's named that don't answer to reason. He looked sorry and scared, which is a hard pair to wear at once. Colt felt the rolled strip of blue cloth in his pocket, the small pricks the pair had left in his skin. He let the door open enough that the lamplight showed his empty hands, and not enough to show the chair. I fed a child, he said. That's all? Hiram laughed without humor. And that there all is how towns burn. They'll count her beads same as you did, and they'll count your scalp against it. You think they'll listen to your good deed once arrows start? He pointed with his jaw at the cottonwood scar where rope had shined the bark smooth years back. Might as well oil that limb while you're at it. Asa looked down, thumb rubbing the star like he wanted the shine back on it. I ought to ride in and raise the guard, he said quiet. I reckon I have to, but I can give you a stretch. He tipped his head toward the east. If you're taking her back, you do it before that moon clears the rim. After that, every shadow's got eyes. Walk a white man into a Comanche camp after dark? Hiram snorted. Why don't you just send him out with a torch in each hand so they can aim better? He leaned in his saddle. Hand her out, Hayes. Let the law make her safe. Law's what we got instead of mercy when mercy gets folks dead. Reverend Silas lifted a palm as if to smooth the talk like a wrinkled shirt. Hiram, he said soft, leave a little room. Then to Colt, if there's a way to set it right without blood, find it soon. A crowd's a fast horse with a blind bridle. Blue edged forward and put himself between the men and the door. Not mean, not wagging, just there. Dogs have their own scripture. Asa's mare lowered her head and blew at him, and Blue blinked, unimpressed. Do what you will, Hiram said, gathering his reins like a man wraps bad thoughts tight. But don't say your neighbors didn't warn you when your place smokes tomorrow. He wheeled his bay. Asa lingered one breath longer and touched 2 fingers to his hat brim at Colt, a plain man's goodbye. Reverend Silas said nothing more. He put his eyes on the ground and prayed with his jaw, and then turned his pony slow. They rode off into their own dust, talk drifting back in pieces and then going to hush. The yard filled with the little sounds a place makes when men leave it. Boards relaxing, a fly changing windows, Blue letting breath out in a long line. Colt stood where he'd stood, watching the space they'd left. Far out along the draw, he could still feel the look of fires on the rim, though the light here had gone from brass to pewter. He shut the door close and looked at the chair. The child had not woken. The scarf rode her collarbone like a promise. He stepped to the porch to kick the mud from his heel, and about missed the shape on the ground under the cottonwood. A coil of fresh rope lay there, clean hemp, not weathered, not old. Somebody had dropped it quiet while talk worked at the front of the house. He looked up. Overhead, the same limb the bark knew reached a little lower into the evening. The new rope's end had been thrown and caught. The loop hung there now, finished work waiting on a man's mistake. The wind came out of the north and pushed the loop just enough that it knocked the trunk, a light, ugly tap. Blue gave a sound far down in his chest that wasn't for show. Out beyond the creek, something shifted. The sky thinned. The land held its breath again, longer this time. Dark came on like a slow spill. Heat left the yard and the creek glassed over, taking the last of the sky with it. Far out along the benches, small fires kindled one by one until the rim looked seeded with fallen stars. Then the sound came. Hand drums, not loud, not fast, just a walking beat that seemed to come out of the dirt itself. It crossed the water and set the porch boards humming in their nails. Blue lifted his head before the first thump landed and stared into the black like he could read what the firelight didn't tell. In the chair, the girl stirred out of sleep and blinked. She listened with her whole face. Her hand came up and she began to count the way children do, when numbers are too many, 5s and 10s at first, then more, fingers opening and closing like little white birds. She ran out of hands and started over. Somewhere past 100 her mouth set, and the counting turned from fear into a kind of work. Colt took down the lamp to a heartbeat of wick and let the house go mostly to shadow. He unbuckled his gun belt by touch and folded it once and set it on the table beside the tin cup, the way a man lays aside an easy habit so he won't reach for it by mistake. He checked the bowl, clean, the spoon, dry, the blanket tucked. The room smelled of beans and iron and the last curl of lamp smoke. Outside, the drums shifted step. A horse blew softly. Leather creaked. Then quiet stacked up again, thicker for the sound that had just been. When a crowd knows what it's about, it don't need noise to say it. The girl pushed the wool up under her chin. The beads at her throat caught the lamp's thin line and flashed once, a blue spark in all that brown. She looked to him not for a plan exactly, just to see where a man put his eyes when trouble came. He let her see him breathe. He went to the door and set his palm on the jamb and held still. The cottonwood outside made a slow, wordless complaint, bark speaking to rope. Blue's ears tipped forward, then flattened, then rose again, as if answering a question only dogs get asked. Figures gathered along the far bank, riders easing into a curve that widened and then drew in until it made a clean arc from mesquite to cottonwood. No whoop, no gallop. It was all patience. Paint and feather took the fire in streaks. One rider slid out front and kept on coming until the creek took him. He sat there high and square, face marked, hair bound with 2 hawk bells that never made a sound. You could feel him the way you feel cold through coat. Red lance, though no one had to say. From somewhere behind him a voice rose, old and carried, the English careful, the authority not. White man, it said as if stating weather, we know what you have that is ours. Send out the child. Perhaps you live to see morning. The drums stopped like a hand closed around them. The pause afterward pressed on the house. It asked a kind of question. A coward's answer would have been quick. Colt, let the question sit. He turned back to the table and touched the pocket, where the ceremonial ribbon lay tight-rolled, felt the memory of prickles in his skin. He put a hand on the girl's shoulder. Her bones felt like a bird's. Hush now, he said, not because she was noisy, but because it steadied him to say it. She nodded and stood, small and straight, Blue taking her measure and then moving to stand between her and the open. Colt set his hat down on the peg and didn't take it. He rubbed his palms against his trousers and looked at them. A plain man's hands, nicked and honest. The first law out here isn't written, but it holds better than most. You show what you are, and you do it without flourish. He drew a slow breath so deep it touched grief and came back with iron in it. Then he lifted the latch and pulled the door wide. Night wind came through the room like a tide, puffing the wick and lifting the scarf's loose end. Colt stepped over the sill into that big drawn circle with his hands open and empty, a man with nothing to hide and nothing to sell. Night air shouldered through the room like a cold hand, puffing the wick, lifting the loose end of the wool at the girl's throat. She rose from the chair without a sound, small palm fastening to Colt's shirt, as if that cloth were the last straight thing in a tipping world. Blue slid ahead, ribs tight, tail level, the way old dogs make themselves into a fence. Across the creek the ark held. Riders and horses were one shape, dark cutouts against their own fires. A man stepped his mount forward until creek light made a clean edge on his cheek. Paint lay there, not pretty, just true, and 2 hawk bells at his braid kept still. The bow in his hands wasn't drawn, not yet, but the string lay against the grip like a thought waiting to be said. Red Lance didn't speak. He didn't have to. From deeper in the line another horse came, no hurry to it, and a voice followed. Older, measured, carried on enough English to make there be no mistake. "Bring the child," it said. "We will see what you are." Colt showed empty hands and let them hang, palms open to the dark. He didn't step down off the porch until his breath had found that even gait a man needs for walking into other people's circles. When he did, he went slow, the girl close at his side, Blue pacing a half-yard forward and a half-yard back, as if measuring danger and drafting a plan that would use his teeth last. "Easy," Colt said. Not to the men across the water, not even to the child. To himself, mostly. He stopped at the cottonwood where the new rope hung quiet as a snake that had decided on patience. Wind slid it once, a dry whisper against bark. The front rider, Gray Hawk, if names can be known by the way, space makes room for a man, sat tall and let his horse drink light off the creek. His eyes worked the porch, the door, the girl's face, then Colt's, then the window where lamplight thinned to a thread. The camp behind. Him stayed rock still. When you have 200 men who can be still, you have more than numbers. Colt set his voice low so it wouldn't carry like a dare. "I'm reachin' in my pocket," he said, each word slow enough for a man to follow with his eyes. "Cloth, nothing else." Red Lance's bow came up a hand's breadth, the string finding whisper. Gray Hawk moved one finger and the bow settled, not far, not friendly, but off its hair trigger. Colt pinched thumb and forefinger into his pocket and brought the ribbon out as if it were a bird that might break. The blue showed even in that meager light, river color with the pulled threads of cactus spines still in it. He held it at arm's length, palm open beneath it, the way you offer back a tool to its owner. The girl made a small sound in her throat and touched the beadwork at her collar, then the torn place at the seam. She lifted both toward the creek. A child's clear accounting. This belongs to that. No speech, no plea. Her hands said invoices and answers. Gray Hawk dismounted like a man stepping down into his own yard. He came to the water and knelt, dipped 2 fingers to wet, and slicked the dust off a square of the ribbon until the pattern read true. 2 black chevrons, a red path, all of it lined with blue that hadn't seen wash in weeks. He looked at the beads at the child's throat and back at the ribbon and back once more at Colt's face, not hunting for a lie there so much as hunting for what a man's eyes do when they're done lying. He took the cloth without grabbing, without thanks, held it up where the line could see it, then tucked it against his palm like one more fact he intended to keep. Behind him leather creaked. Far to the right, a horse struck and settled. Red Lance let the bow tilt again, small, the difference between live and dead you could cover with a thumb. Colt didn't talk. He didn't know enough, and out here the stuff you don't know can kill quicker than what you do. He kept his hands where a nervous man could watch them and let his shoulders stand square to the arc. The girl stayed at his hip, chin up in that stubborn way hunger gives you. Blue took one step to put himself in front of her shins and planted. Gray Hawk's mouth worked once. He looked past Colt to the open door. "Inside," he said. Not a request, not a rage shout either, a judge's word. Colt felt the house at his back, bean smell, iron, stove heat, the picture on the shelf waiting where it always waited. He turned and led the girl inside, leaving the door wide so the night could look. Greyhawk crossed the creek without getting wet and came after. Red Lance held where he was, bow on his knees, eyes hard as flint, and the ark behind him eased its breath and then pulled it tight again. The room took all three of them and made a smaller silence. The lamp showed the bent silver spoon and the empty bowl, with its ring like a halo left by hunger. The wool scarf's loose end fluttered and lay down. On the shelf, the tintype caught a grain of light and gave back faces that were gone but wouldn't leave. Greyhawk's gaze went from the spoon to the bowl, to the blanket, to the dog, to the photograph, and stayed there. He reached and touched the frame with 2 fingers, not the glass, not the picture, just the wood, like a man checking the edge of a tool. Then he set his hand away, palm flat to his thigh, and the tendon stood in his wrist. Outside, string moved on 100 bows at once, a soft rasp like grasshoppers in June. Men do that when they're waiting to be told what they already want. A scrap of cloth and a clean bowl, a bent spoon and a picture, little things set against a wide night and a tight circle. The wind made a pass through the room and went out, and the house, the men, the dog, the child, and the dark all seemed to hold the same thin breath, to see if small proof could outtalk big trouble. The door stood wide and the night leaned in, but the room kept its own weather, iron heat from the stove, bean salt in the air, lamp wick turned down to a thread. The girl's chair was set just so, wool pulled high, blue anchored at her shins like a log thrown across a ford. Colt took 2 steps in and stopped where the floor knew his weight. Behind him, Greyhawk came without brushing a thing, a man who could move through someone else's house without leaving a mark. The lamp found what it always found. On the table, the bowl had its brown ring where stew had been. A smear of pork fat made a dull moon at the bottom. The bent silver spoon lay canted, its handle wavering from years leaning into hot pots. A torn heel of cornbread had left dust-yellow crumbs like little chips of prairie, the kind of evidence no man writes down because it writes itself. Greyhawk's eyes traveled the room slow, not suspicious, just exact. Spoon, bowl, blanket, dog, shelf. He paused at the scarf where the weave thinned to nubs, and at the place on the chair arm polished by a single life. The lamplight climbed to the shelf and caught the tintype. Glass gave back a pale ghost of 3 faces if you stood right, 2 in the picture, 1 in the shine. Colt took the frame down and set it in the open as if there were a right way for a stranger to see his dead. His hand shook once and quit. The chief reached with 2 fingers and touched the wood, not the glass, as if to learn the measure of grief by grain. He stood that way a breath, listening to the room with more than ears. Things speak if you let them. A clean bowl says as much as a sworn oath. A dog that won't move from a child says more than either. The girl rose, the beads at her throat whispering against the wool. She made no talk. She lifted one hand to her mouth, chewed a ghost bite, tipped her head back like sleep, then pointed at Colt and pressed her small palm to her own chest. It wasn't much, and it was everything. Fed, a rest, safe, him. She looked at Greyhawk and held the look, the way brave people do before they're old enough to know they are. Outside, the line along the creek shifted. Bowstrings found the same note at once, a dry rasp you could mistake for grasshoppers if you hadn't lived long. Somewhere a pony stamped and was still. Red Lance's voice cut across the hush. Not words Colt understood, but the sense was plain as a brand. Time was a rope drawn short. Greyhawk let his hand fall from the picture. He took in the ribbon Colt had returned. River blue and cactus pricked, now set square on the table beside the spoon, a thing brought out where any eye might test it. He touched the cloth and his jaw worked once. A father is a country unto himself. Even a quiet one has storms. Colt kept his mouth shut because talk wastes the proof a room is making for you. He stood where a nervous man could see his hands. He felt the tin cup against his knuckles cool with the last wash, and set it near the bowl. So the two read together. Water given, food given. Any jury worth a damn starts with such things. The wind stepped through the doorway and lifted the scarf's loose end and laid it down again. It found the new hemp outside and knocked it once against cottonwood bark. Tick, like a clerk entering a tally no one wanted. Blue's ears pricked and flattened and pricked again. The dog's chest rose higher. The girl's breath kept to its narrow lane. Greyhawk turned, not to leave, but to take the room as a whole into himself one last time. He looked at Colt, not hard, not soft, just level, as if asking a question that didn't need words. "Who are you when nobody's watching?" Colt answered with his stillness. "A man can lie with his mouth. It's harder with his shoulders." He held the picture up into the light and set it down where it lived. He set the spoon straight as if to say he understood the language here and would not speak over it. From the creek bank, Red Lance gave a short, sharp call, and the young ones answered, brittle with heat. The arc tightened a thumb's width. 100 strings kissed wood. If a knight had a trigger, someone had found it. The chief moved first. He stepped to the threshold and filled it, neither blocking the door nor clearing it, just standing where all lines met. He raised a hand the smallest distance, and the sound outside paused in its own mouth. Then he looked back at the child and said something low in the tongue her bones knew. She nodded once, small but sure, and set her hand on Colt's sleeve like she had earlier, not to hide, but to name witness. Greyhawk crossed the room and lifted the picture again, not to take it, only to see the faces without glass between. He put it down careful and flattened the grass ring with his palm, blessing or measure or both. When his hand came away, there were 3 dry stalks on his skin. He brushed them to the floor and did not pick them up. Some small things you leave where they fall because moving them would mean pretending they hadn't. The drums outside found their feet again, slower now, like the earth was thinking. Red Lance called once more, the kind of call you give a chief when you're close to doing a thing on your own if he won't. The night had come up tight against the door jamb. In the space between one breath and the next, the world waited to see whether proof made of beans and wool, and a picture could hold back young men's fire. The line along the creek tightened until the crescent looked cut with a knife. Young horses worked the bit and were told no with knees. Feathers carried a slow shine from the fires behind them. Red Lance slid his pony a pace forward so that the bow in his hands made one straight of wood and string in anger. He said something quick and edged, and the young ones behind him gave it back in a low answer that wasn't quite a shout yet, but was already trouble. Greyhawk stood easy in the doorway, as if a house were any other piece of ground that would bear him. He didn't lift a hand. His eyes took in the arc, and then came back to the girl and the man and the small room that smelled of beans and iron and old wool. Red Lance pushed again, not his horse this time, but his voice, the kind that makes a crack in a dam if you don't set your shoulder to it. He turned the bow sideways, not aiming, just pointing the world at the chief's ribs. Blue's growl came up out of the boards. That low saw a man hears as much in his bones as in his ears. The girl's fingers found Colt's sleeve and tightened, then let go. She stepped out from behind his leg like a quail leaving shadow, chin up, beads ticking at her throat. In the yard there was the tiny sound of boot leather and iron. Old Gus had come from nowhere the way old men do, who've learned doorways better than paths. He had a coffee pot by the handle and 2 tin cups nested, and he set one on the top step as if he were laying a coin on a table to keep a wind from taking the map. He didn't look at Colt or the chief or the line or the rope. He looked at the night, the way men do when they've slept under it too often to flatter it. "Long night," he said to no one. "Read what's true." From the mesquite edge, Miguel Ortega eased into the light, like a man trying not to spook a team. He didn't come close. He held his hands out from his sides to show they were empty of anything but intention. If talk needed bridging, he was built for planks. Red Lance's pony danced and came back under him. He shifted the bow, then dropped it to his thigh and took up a lance from behind his knee. The haft worked in his palm, and the head found the dark like it was pointing at an answer it had known for years. He brought it level until the iron tip stood a hand from Greyhawk's chest. The line behind him tightened with that small sucking sound of air 100 men make when a thing is about to tip. It would have taken one twitch, and the night would have torn. Greyhawk didn't move. His face said nothing and said a lot. Not today, not for a boy's heat. Not while an old law stood inside this doorway with a bowl and a blanket to back it. He spoke 3 words in his own tongue, not loud. Red Lance's eyes flickered like a horse that has seen wire where grass used to be. He didn't lower the lance, he didn't lift it either. The point hung there, a needle over a heart. Inside the room, the spoon lay straight beside the empty bowl, the ribbons blue dulling as the lamp sank. Colt could feel the stove's last heat on his knees. He kept his hands where they were, the way you hold a board steady so someone else can saw true. He could count his pulse at his wrists. He thought of the dried grass ring around the picture and how a man keeps small circles because the big ones don't answer to him. The young men in the line began to lean forward in their saddles, mouths hard. One of them spoke fast, then faster, and the rest took it. Chorus bent on making itself law. The horses under them remembered old raids in their bones and stepped in place like old songs make you do. Old Gus didn't blink. He poured coffee into the empty cup and set the pot back to the cool of the step. Steam rose and went dark. "Hot," he said, as if the night had asked. Miguel said a few words in Comanche that were all edges rounded off by respect. He pointed once at the door, once at the girl, then put his hand flat on his own chest and left it there. Red Lance spoke with his whole body now, the spear describing a tight half-circle in the air, as his arm argued. Greyhawk answered with less motion than it takes to push a fly away. The 2 stances met like 2 pieces of iron meeting at a grindstone. Sparks you can't see. Heat you can feel. The rope in the cottonwood knocked the trunk once. Tick. The noise ran through the line like a dare. The youngest rider grinned without humor and lifted his bow higher by the width of a finger. That was as far as it needed to go for the rest to follow. Then the girl stepped fully out into the yard and into the line of that lance and stood where a point would reach, first because it had to pass through her to get to any man. She didn't flinch. She wasn't brave so much as exact. She lifted her 2 hands and told 4 small truths with them, in the only language nobody forgets. I was hungry. He fed me. I was cold. He kept me. She touched the beads at her throat, then pointed at the blue ribbon on the table through the open door, then opened her hands as if to show they were empty of lies. Miguel found the words and sent them careful across the water. He didn't add or polish. He carried them. She says he fed her and did not hold her. She says she slept and woke. She says nothing bad was done. She says he has the eyes of a man who has buried a child. The crack in the war line didn't open yet, but you could hear it wish to. Red Lance's lance dropped a thumb. The young ones behind him swallowed a cheer or a curse. You couldn't tell which. Greyhawk's jaw eased enough to let breath through. Blue moved up a step and put his shoulder to the girl's shin with the lightest touch, like a brace under a beam. Colt did not pull her back because some bridges only hold if you don't test them with your own weight. He kept his eyes on Red Lance and not on the iron at the chief's chest. Somebody far down the line called out something sharp and high. Another answered low. The night had more than one opinion, and both were growing teeth. The girl stood there small and straight, with the rope creaking above her and the ring of dried grass around a picture catching lamp glint inside a house that might be a courtroom if men let it. The next breath would decide which kind of law the dark was hungry for. She stepped out where the iron point would have to pass through her to reach any man. The rope above made its small, mean creak. The fires on the rim held steady, as if the stars themselves were leaning down to listen. She didn't speak first with her mouth. Her hands did the telling, fingers to lips, a pinch of air to mean hunger, palm circling her belly, the old sign. A cup shape lifted, then tipped as if to pour, both palms pressed to her own ribs, then one small hand set flat against Colt's sleeve and left there. Federal, watered, kept. Him. The girl lifted the beadwork at her throat, then pointed through the open door to the blue ribbon on the table and to the clean ring inside the bean bowl. The book of the evening written in grease and absence. Miguel Ortega found the words like a man walking a plank he'd tested with his heel. She says she was empty and he filled her. She says he did not tie, did not trade, did not ask. She slept. She woke. He was still there. The line along the creek breathed, some in and some out. Red Lance's jaw stayed iron. He turned his head the smallest piece to the girl, and back to Greyhawk, as if to ask which wind had blown this kind of testimony into a night made for other business. The child went on. She lifted 2 fingers as if counting brothers and shook her head no. Then she faced Red Lance proper, took a step that put the lance's shadow across her face, and asked him a thing that, even without translation, sat heavy in a man's chest. Miguel carried it plain. She asks, "Do you have a child?" It landed like a stone in a cold pan. Red Lance didn't answer with sound. His shoulders eased a nail width, then braced again. A man who had not yet met such a question in open ground. The horses close to him quit working their bits and just breathed. She says, Miguel went on, voice careful, "If your boy were lost, hungry, sick, would you want a stranger to drive him off like a coyote, or would you want him brought to a chair, given a bowl, given a blanket, and not ask the price?" He didn't polish it. He let the rough edges be. The girl turned then to the house and to the shelf. She went to the threshold, but not inside, reached for the tintype without touching, and held it in both hands of the air, the way people take up grief when they don't dare disturb it. She looked to Greyhawk, and then to Red Lance, and then to Colt. Miguel's voice thinned. She says he has eyes like a father who is buried. The war line made a sound men don't mean to make. One low note that runs the length of a string and back. Somebody coughed like a bark and shut it in his fist. The rope in the cottonwood tapped once against bark, as if keeping count of what mercy costs. Greyhawk stood where the doorway framed him, and took the girl's words as one takes weather, face open, not fighting the wind, feeling for the shift behind it. He spoke in his own tongue, a short thing that sounded like a name and a blessing and a warning braided. The answer came back from 3 places in the line, and then, after a beat, from Red Lance. The same word, not sweetened, not soured, just given. Old Gus poured the second tin cup and set it beside the first, as if setting places at a table no one had thought to lay. Steam rose and went to dark. Blue eased his shoulder harder against the girl's shin, asking nothing but the right to stand ready. Colt had not spoken since saying hush. He didn't now. He left his hands where a nervous man could see them, and let the small proofs keep talking. The spoon set straight, the bowl clean, the ribbon rolled from a cactus's grip and given back, the picture where it lived. A jury likes facts that hold still. Red Lance's lance dropped another inch, then another. He set the butt to earth and stood over it with both palms, as if the ground's answer might come up through wood. His eyes went to the child, then to Greyhawk, then to Colt, and nowhere else. A young man can be fierce and still know the weight of a thing when it's set in his hands. You could see the arithmetic happen in him: blood, honor, proof, promise, and watch him choose which column ought to count tonight. Miguel cleared his throat. "She says," he offered softer now, "if we punish kindness, we will turn into what they think we are." The rim fires seemed to pull farther apart, like stars giving one another room. Red Lance took one step back and lifted his lance away from the chief's chest. The bowstrings along the creek relaxed all at once with that dry little whisper a prairie makes when it says "thank you" without using a word. Greyhawk looked at Colt a long time, not to test him now, but to measure whether a man built of bean bowls and pictures and straight spoons could carry a thing farther than a night. His gaze went to the girl. She didn't drop her chin. He inclined his head a hair toward her, and then toward the east, and where the land opened in a long black seam. When he spoke in English, it came slow and sure enough to stand on. "Not here," he said. "Not in a yard with the young heat. The old fire will hear it." He turned his horse with no hurry and no sound and let it step from shadow to creek light. The arc bent to make a way. Red Lance swung in close and set his pony nose to the chief's knee, a soldier's place and not a rival's. Behind them the line shifted from a weapon's curve to a road. Greyhawk looked back once more at the door, at the bowl, at the picture that held a woman and a boy and the dry ring of grass around them, then at Colt. What he said was not a question and not a threat. "Come." The girl's hand found Colt's sleeve again, not begging now, offering. Blue flicked his ear and went to the yard as if he'd learned the route long ago. Old Gus lifted the coffee pot and shook out the last drop so the cup wouldn't slosh on the ride. Miguel stepped aside to make a gap between mesquite like a man holding a gate. Colt set his hat, took up nothing, and followed. The noose in the cottonwood turned once in the north wind and came still, left behind by a moving night. They moved east into country that didn't show itself unless you knew where to look. The war line unstrung into pairs and threes, filing through breaks in the mesquite the way water finds old ruts after a hard rain. Greyhawk rode ahead with a slow hand on his horse, Red Lance a half length off his knee. No one talked. Drums didn't carry out here. The night itself did the counting. The creek fell away to a ribbon and the ground lifted in sandstone steps. Colt kept the girl tight to his knee and let Blue find the safe places. Old dogs know stone like carpenters know grain. In the dark, the yucca blades whispered across trouser cloth. Ocotillo reached up like black fingers. Every so often a pony would stumble and catch, leather popping, and the line would wait as one without needing to be told. They slid into a slot cut by 1,000 storms. The walls held moon the color of tin, so cold it looked wet. It was quiet enough to hear grit ticking out from under a hoof, the kind of quiet that presses on a man the way a hand presses on a wound to keep it from talking. Far above, the rim threw back a coyote's sharp remark and then swallowed it. Miguel shadowed them on the right bank, reins in 2 fingers, mouth shut. He didn't look at Colt, he looked at the girl's feet. She'd kept up better than Bone ought to, but you could hear the small drag she didn't let herself make. When they came out of the cut to a low windmill that turned slow as prayer, a lantern lifted out of its own circle like a moth and became a woman. June Kittredge didn't make a fuss about permission. She stood where the trail had to pass and raised the light so it lit the girl's shins and not the men's eyes. A strip of hair had escaped her scarf and lay against her cheekbone like a drawn line. She had a roll of clean cloth over one arm and a bottle corked with a whittled peg. Greyhawk's horse checked a step and then came on. He didn't nod. He didn't have to. June knelt without asking and took the girl's foot into her lap. The child didn't flinch until the wool came off, and then set her jaw. The soles were scuffed raw, not bleeding fresh now, but ready to. June poured a narrow wash that smelled sharp and right, set her thumb to the worst places with a kind firmness no man has, and wrapped both feet neat as a seam. She tamped the last tuck under with her nail and tied off. "Don't let the night climb up your legs," she said, mostly to the air. Her eyes went to Colt, and found him the way women do when they've learned the weight a man carries by what he doesn't say. She stood and set one hand on the child's crown, the smallest heartbeat. Eat when they let you, sleep when they don't. Red Lance's pony slid sideways at the lantern's flare and settled. The men behind watched that small sacrament with horse eyes. June took a piece of bread from her bag, broke it in two, and gave the larger half to Blue, who accepted with old court manners and chewed like a gentleman asked to stay for supper. The smaller she pressed into the girl's palm and closed her fingers over it like closing a box. The windmill turned once and clicked. Greyhawk put his horse forward and June stepped aside, with the lantern and the bottle and the quiet she'd brought. She didn't look back. The line lengthened again and went on. Country changed its mind twice more, flat to fold, brush to grass, stone to sand, until the smell of smoke came thinned and thoughtful. Ahead, low lights pricked the dark, not the camp stars from a ridge, but many small hearths in a draw. They didn't blink. They held, the way family fires hold when there's talking to be done. Colt felt for the tin cup at his belt and brushed it with his knuckles the way a man touches a charm he won't admit is won. He didn't say it to make a point. He said it because the words fit his mouth and needed saying. "I won't leave." The girl heard it, even if she didn't catch the syllables. She answered by sitting straighter in the saddle and keeping her eyes on the lights. They came to a stand of cottonwoods, older than any man riding there, and slid between trunks set like pillars. A narrow stream ran black and sure. Beyond it the village lay arranged in a wide sweep, hides and poles and the long shadows of work. People were up. Women stood with shawls crossed and children peered from behind them, and old men sat where their bones had a right to sit, close to fire and air. Dogs weighed the party and rehearsed old reasons to bark and decided against. Red Lance spoke low and the line widened. Greyhawk rode to the center where a space had been kept for him since before he was born. 7 men rose together from their haunches and made half a circle with their bodies. Their hair took the fire in silver. Their faces didn't have room for anger. They had room for measure. One of them carried a stick worn smooth with years of other nights like this. Colt swung down when the chief did. He didn't reach to lift the child. She slid on her own and took his sleeve at the cuff, a small place where cloth knows skin. Blue stopped with his front feet just at the shadow's edge and lay down, chin on paws, tail flat, asking no account. Miguel hung back where shadows kept him honest and useful. Old Gus wasn't there. Coffee cups don't ride that far. But a smell from one of the fires said somebody here. Boiled beans the same way he did. And the thought went through Colt like the first swallow of water after a day of dust. The elders set their half circle, and the young men closed an outer one, like a second hoop, to keep the night out. Women stood beyond, the shawls dark as creek water. Somewhere a baby let out one test wail and then went over to sleep again, because people who have always lived near. Drums know when they need to wake and when they don't. Greyhawk said a thing that quieted footsteps. The stick passed hand to hand until it found the oldest palm and rested. No one looked at Colt long. No one looked away either. A place can be a courtroom without walls if the ground there remembers truth. He felt the pull of his pictures, even here. He looked down at the hand that had set a bowl, straightened a spoon, turned a lamp low. It seemed a foolish hand to bring into a circle like this. He set it still against his thigh and let it be. The oldest man lifted the stick, not high, just enough to bring the air to attention. He spoke a string of words in a voice used to being obeyed by time. Miguel would likely find pieces of it and carry them after. For now, it was the sound of a gate shutting to keep stock from wandering. Colt and the girl stood inside that sound with the dog and the chief, and the slow firelight climbing cottonwood trunks behind them. Between one breath and the next, the circle closed, not to choke, but to listen. The half-circle of elders settled like stones set by a river long ago. Firelight ran the length of their cheekbones and left the hollows dark. The oldest held a stick worn to satin by nights like this. He didn't grip it like a weapon, but like a ledger he meant to keep honest. Young men formed a second ring farther out, shoulders squared, bows across their laps. Women stood behind them with shawls crossed tight, faces unreadable as the rim. Greyhawk stepped into the speaking place without hurry. He didn't make a case so much as set the facts down where the air could touch them. He told what he'd seen with his own eyes at a white man's house, a small chair warm from a child's sleep, a wool scarf tugged high, a bean bowl wiped clean by hunger, not by pride, a bent silver spoon that had learned its curve from heat and time, a picture of a woman and a boy rimmed in dried grass, a man replaced each week for love. Then he lifted the blue ribbon Colt had handed back and laid it on the earth so the pattern could speak its own name. When he finished, he looked at no one. He let the fire do its work. Miguel didn't add shine. He walked each word across into English and back again, boards laid close so no one would fall through. Red Lance came in next, not to shout but to set counterweight. His voice held the dry edge of iron. Young blood, he said, was taught by old grief that mercy wears another face by daylight. If men were allowed to touch what was sacred and walk free by showing a clean bowl, what kept tomorrow's thieves from learning the trick? He did not name Colt a liar. He named danger by its proper name, precedent. The ring behind him answered with one breath, tight and cold. The oldest elder turned the stick in his palm and watched the smoke run up and thin. He asked no cross questions of the chief, none of the young spearman. He looked to the girl. She stepped forward, without looking back at Colt. The beadwork at her throat caught a coal's red and held it an instant. She did not testify again with her hands. She had already done that. She stood where children stand when they decide not to be children for a moment and let the old man see that she understood the price of whatever came next. He spoke to her in words that had been old when his own hair was black. The sounds were simple as bread. Do you truly believe the man who fed you would do it again if it cost him everything he has left? She didn't glance at Colt. She didn't borrow his courage. She nodded once, slow enough to be counted. It was an answer weighted the way stones are weighted, by what they've held up. Across the outer ring, some of the young set their jaws. Low talk fluttered and died. A baby offered one thin cry and went quiet, like even small lungs understood a measure had been taken. Colt stood with his hands loose at his sides, feeling the grit under his nails and the heat on his shins, thinking how a life can narrow to a single yes given by someone who owes you nothing. He had brought no fine speech and no tally of favors. The ribbon lay on the dirt, the picture lived in his house miles behind him, and still a verdict was being built from small, honest things. Red Lance's eyes never left the child's face. You could see it work through him, the pull of old law, the ache of what if it were mine, the stubborn dignity of not wanting to be fooled by a stranger's good story or his own hunger for a decent ending. He looked to Greyhawk. The chief gave him nothing but the steadiness of a man who has seen more nights than a lance has years. The oldest elder set the stick across his knees and spoke again. Fewer words this time, as if a long road had brought him to a short gate. Miguel gathered them carefully. The spirits send more than storms. Sometimes they send a test, not of war, of whether we know mercy when it stands in our yard. He put his hand flat, old tendons standing. If mercy is punished, we become what we have lived to deny. A ripple went out, approval in some throats, heat in others. Red Lance took it like weather. He did not bow, he did not break. He set his lance upright and rested both palms on it, a sign a fighting man can make when the fight moves from arm to law. But the night wasn't done with its teeth. From the far edge where the second ring met the dark, a knot of boys with too much horse and not enough winter in them hissed their displeasure. One called out a word sharp as a spur, the kind that tries to shame elders back into youth. The sound ran a little way and then stumbled. Women's shawls tightened, dogs lifted their heads. The elder did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He named the balance he would strike. The man who fed the child would be given safe road and the shelter of their word. More than that, his place would be held as a door where hunger could knock without fear. But mercy, like any gift worth having, would carry its own chain. He must promise, before fire and night and all these eyes, that any Comanche who came to his yard in need would leave fed, warmed, and listened to, or else this reprieve would turn to dust and the rope would learn his name after all. Miguel let the words land in English. They did not lose weight in crossing. Colt didn't hurry his answer. He had promised such a thing already, in the quiet, to himself and to two faces in a frame. He said it now so the world could hear. I give it, he told the ground and the fire and the rings of men. It wasn't grand. It was steady. The old man nodded once and set the stick down where it had been at the start. Greyhawk reached to the dirt and took up the blue ribbon. Not to keep it, he would give it back to smaller hands when this smoke cooled, but to hold the thread of the night in his palm a breath longer. Red Lance looked out over the outer ring and the boys who had hissed and then back to the girl. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. He gave a short nod a man gives to a truth he can't argue with and still wishes he could. The ash above the fire rose and drifted toward the cottonwoods. Somewhere a drum found a new beat, slow and even, like a heart that has decided to live. The old man turned the stick across his knees and spoke 6 words that even a stranger could read by the way heads bowed. A woman stepped from the ring with a clay bowl and a flat of cornbread wrapped in cloth. Another poured from a blackened pot that smelled like every dawn on the plains. The elders had asked for proof no mouth could outtalk. Share what you would deny an enemy, and do it in the open. Colt didn't look for permission. He took a knee where the dirt showed old footprints and held out his tin cup. The woman filled it not to the brim. No waste, no show. He set the cup to the ground where all could see the steam and broke the bread by its seam, not by its crust the way you do when you intend to hand it on. He ladled beans with a battered spoon so the liquor wet the bread and set the spoon aside straight, handle to the fire. Greyhawk stepped first because it was his to risk. He crouched and took the cup as if it were a tool he'd used all his life. He drank once, slow, then handed it back to Colt and took the bread. He did not tear a big piece or a small one. He took the piece the night asked and chewed and swallowed and let air go out of his chest the way a man does when he's set a heavy thing down in the right place. Colt turned with the cup still warm and held it toward Red Lance. The young man's face carried the day's worth of argument. He let it be there. He looked at the child and at the ribbon in the chief's hand and at the bowl where beans had glossed the crust. He took the cup like a man picking up a live coal and raised it enough to wet his mouth. Nothing in him changed and everything did. He handed it back without looking away and reached for the bread. He didn't lift it. He set his palm on it, a soldier's oath with no trumpet to it, then broke off what he would have fed a brother and put it down again for others. Around the outer ring, the bows eased to wood with a whisper like tall grass. A few throats made a low sound, not quite content and not quite sorrow. The rope of the night loosened a turn. The oldest elder rose without the stick, and the village rose with him in the particular silence that carries a verdict. He named the thing so there would be no talking, it crooked later. Mercy had been shown. Mercy would be held, and mercy would travel with a halter. The house of the white man would be a door without price for any who came hungry, cold, or hurt. In return, their word would stand around his fence like cedar, breakable by weather, not by whim. If he failed the door, he promised the rope he'd left hanging would learn his weight. Miguel walked the words into English and back where they belonged. There was no loss in the going. Colt turned the cup in his hand so the handle found him. He didn't have to think for the words. He had said them already to two faces in a frame and to the blue dark of a lonely house. He said them where fire and law could catch them. I'll feed who comes hungry, he told the ground. I'll warm 'em and hear 'em. I won't ask a price. You can set that on me. The old man gave him the smallest of nods. A craftsman's approval when a joint sits true. Greyhawk lifted the ribbon and touched it once to the girl's shoulder, then to Colt's sleeve, then let it hang from his hand again, the red path and the black chevrons in the blue, like a strip of creek saved from drought. He looked to Red Lance. The young man stepped forward and set his lance upright, palms on the haft, not in challenge now, but in keeping. He spoke a line that clicked through the rings like a spur rowel, finding each tooth in turn. Miguel carried it with no polish. I'll stand for the word. The elders answered it together with a breath that ended where the cottonwoods began. Keeper was the old name for such a post. If the law bent, it would bend through him first. Women let their shawls ease a finger. Dogs laid their chins down again. A coal popped, throwing one gold seed into the dust. Blue found it worth watching and then decided sleep was a better use of a dog's night. Colt rinsed the cup with a swallow from a gourd and set it upside down by the bowl, lip to earth. He straightened the spoon so its crooked handle pointed home. The small neatness, done where every eye could see, was not for show. It was the only way he knew to close a moment without breaking it. Far up the draw, a gray seam tore in the east. The night pulled back the way a tide does when it remembers its appointment with the moon. Horses lifted their heads, telling one another old stories about miles and men. Red Lance looked once at Colt, not friendly, not unfriendly, just exact, like a ledger that had been checked and would be checked again. He moved to the chief's knee and waited there. Greyhawk set the ribbon into the girl's palm and let his hand rest over hers, a breath longer than custom. The old man sat, with the stick across his lap once more, a plow laid by. The circle did what circles do when a decision has finished with them. It opened into a road. They rode back under a sky, being rewoven from black to pewter, then to that thin prairie gold that makes every fence staple shine. The war line was no longer a blade. It was an escort, 2 and 2, a road made of men instead of dirt. Greyhawk rode at the point, and Red Lance kept the chief's knee, not as a challenge now, but as a post set into ground. The village fell behind like a thought finished clean. The land opened and smoothed. A meadowlark took first light into its throat and let it out pure. Dew picked out spider lines in the grass. The horses' hocks were dark with it. No one spoke. A verdict worth anything carries better in silence. When the cottonwood on Colt's place lifted over the rise, the yard already had its watchers. Hiram Tate sat his bay square in the dooryard, with 2 men whose faces read more worry than spine. Deputy Asa Boone was there too, hat pulled low, star dull with dust. Reverend Silas Pritchard had his coat on, though the hour didn't need it. A man who dresses for news the way he would for church. The rope hung where someone had left it. Bright hemp looped clean over the old scar in the bark, wind giving it a small turn. Hiram saw the line of riders and set his jaw like a vice. His horse felt it and tossed, then stood. Greyhawk didn't hurry, and he didn't slow. He brought the escort to the far side of the creek and let them sit quiet. Red Lance slid a look over the town men that didn't stop to pick up trouble but would have known where to find it. Colt swung down when the chief did. The girls stepped off the far side and took the cuff of his sleeve, more habit than need. Blue trotted ahead, trod the porch once to make it his again, and lay down with his chin over the threshold as if he'd never been away. Asa's hand went to his brim and back. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl. He lifted his voice enough to climb the yard and no higher. "Hear this," he said, and the words were plain as ledger lines. "Night councils said it. This place—" He tipped his chin at the house, the barn, the fence stitched to the pasture. "Stands under protection of Greyhawk's word. Any man raises hand to Hayes or his holdings will answer to the council that sat it, not just to me. And the other parts set as tight. Hungry souls come here, they eat. Cold souls come here, they warm. Hurt souls come here, they're seen to. That's the rope on him. That's the cedar around him." Hiram let his eyes cut to the loop in the tree and back. He had a mouth made for spit and speeches. This morning both dried up. "Since when," he said low and ugly, "does a white man's yard answer to—" Reverend Silas touched his elbow, the way old men quiet cattle by hand. "Hush," he said, and the word wasn't a plea, it was a bell. "There's law, and there's right. We've been short of both. Maybe let one do the other's work a while." His hat came off and stayed off. "You don't have to like mercy to stand up for it." Asa's stare held Hiram a breath longer than was comfortable, and then left him there to decide what kind of neighbor he wanted to be this side of daylight. The two men behind Tate looked at the riders across the creek and learned quickly how to count. Greyhawk stepped his horse to the water's edge and reached down to set his palm on the top rail where Colt had reset the broken post. His hand stayed there long enough to tell the wood something about keeping. He looked at Colt and gave that small nod he'd used the night before when a child's answer had weighed more than 100 young opinions. Red Lance backed his pony 2 steps and set his lance upright, palms on the haft. A keeper's stance, not a challenger's. The boys who had ridden hot last night were not here. Day makes men take inventory. Colt walked to the cottonwood and stood under the loop. He didn't cut it down. He didn't need to. He reached into the doorway and brought out the tin cup, the same one that had sat by a bowl and steamed under judgment, and hung it from a nail on the porch post where any hand could find it. Then he went to the bucket and filled the dipper and set it beside the cup. The little metal thing clicked once in the wind and fell quiet. A note thin as a promise and twice as stubborn. Blue watched, then stretched, and put his body right where a stranger would have to step over him to get to the door. Dogs are the original keepers of fair terms. Hiram Tate worked his jaw and found no purchase. He flicked his reins and put his bay around slow. No dust kicked up, no big words left behind him to make a mess. The two with him went with their hats tipped low, men who'd watched a night they hadn't seen find its way into morning. Asa eased his mare close enough that his boot toe touched Colt's porch stone. "Words out," he said. "I'll keep my side. You keep yours." His eyes went to the cup, then to the rope, then back to Colt. "Don't make me come argue with a tree." Colt nodded once. There were thanks a man says, and thanks he doesn't. The ones he didn't say got said in the way his shoulders finally set square inside his shirt. Greyhawk took up his reins. Before he turned his horse, he reached and put 2 fingers to the girl's beads. and then to Colt's sleeve. A small binding polite as a handshake and stronger. He spoke a line of his own tongue and didn't wait to see if anyone carried it into English. Some words don't travel. They bless where they land, and that's their whole job. The escort lifted and flowed like river water. Red Lance was last to move. He let his gaze find the rope once. He did not nod to it. He let it hang in the wind and be what it was, a warning that had learned a new duty. Then he went after his chief, and the line thinned and vanished down the draw, leaving only hoof prints, the smell of leather, and a slow settling quiet. The yard remembered how to sound like itself. A hen complained about nothing and meant it. The wind ran a light hand through the cottonwood and tapped the rope against bark, tick once, then let it be. The cup on the post swung a finger's width and came still. Colt busied himself the only way he knew to make a promise hold. He walked the fence. He checked the staples, palmed the new set post, tested the gate latch. At the end he stood on the porch with Blue and looked at the cup and the bucket and the door and the room beyond, where a chair would always wait for a tired back. He set his palm to the jamb the way a man blesses a thing he intends to keep. Across the creek the last of the escort showed on the rise and was gone. Asa's horse stamped once and settled. Reverend Silas put his hat back on and looked like a man who had been allowed to keep his faith one more day. The sun came up square over the rim and turned the yard to work. "Folks'll come," Asa said, not warning, not promise. "Some you'll be glad of. Some you'll have to be good to anyhow." Colt picked up the dipper and poured water into the cup and let it steam in the cool. "Doors open," he said. It wasn't much of a speech. It was enough. The place wore time the way a good saddle wears a rider. Creased where it ought to be, shiny where hands had done their work. The barn door had taken polish from 100 mornings of palms, pushing it wide. The gate latch clicked true because someone had filed it until it learned good habits. Old Gus's yucca stood in a line against the north like stiff green bayonets that never meant harm. Cottonwood bark had gone gray as a winter beard, and the scar where a rope once bit lay quiet under lichen. The cup still hung on the porch post from the same nail, tin gone soft at the rim from years of mouths. In wind it gave one small note and let it die decent. Folks learned that sound, teamsters passing east, a cavalry sergeant who had lost a boy to fever, a Comanche mother with a child too hot in winter. When thirst or trouble brought them, that cup rang them in better than any bell. Colt Hayes got older under that sound. He didn't get soft. He learned to pace his day with a little more sense and a little less hurry. When a stranger took the cup, he poured with his left if his right was tired, and the coffee still hit a man square. When bad weather blew in and cattle bunched dumb at the lowest fence, he and whoever had ridden in out of it, sometimes Red Lance and 2 young riders with storm in their hair, shouldered gates together and eased calves out of drifts with the flat of their hands. People saw those things who would never tell stories, and that was better. June Kittredge came and went by seasons, a scarf in her pocket and a needle case in her hand. She taught children, white, Comanche, whoever came up with a cut, to bind a scrape clean and snug, to boil what ought to be boiled, to sleep with wool over the chest when wind set its teeth. She'd stand on the porch with Colt and look at a sky the color of tin and say, "Get your buckets under the eaves." And when the rain came, it did not surprise them. Miguel Ortega brought coffee when he could get it good and cheap, and tallow when beans were scarce, and tidings when tidings were worth hearing. He never took more than 1 cup and never left without putting his back into some small piece of fence that needed it. A man like that wears the country in his boots, and the country forgives him when he's late. Blue lasted longer than anyone would have counted on, long enough to see colts grow into good rope horses, and the girl who had once slept in Colt's chair grow into the kind of woman people look at without meaning to. When the old dog's breath went shallow and his eyes asked for a quiet patch of shade, Colt gave it and put a flat rock at the cottonwood's root, so the yard itself would step careful there. After that, other dogs came and learned the rules from the nail where the cup hung and from the shape a chair makes when it's waiting for a tired back. Taya took longer strides and then longer rides. Language sat easy on her tongue from both directions. She was at Greyhawk's knee some nights, speaking the white man's thoughts into the circle and carrying the circle's answers back into town without cracking them. She laughed the way girls do until they don't, and then she laughed like women laugh when they've had to hold their breath too long. Men from both sides forgot their rehearsed speeches when she stood. She didn't scold them out of their heat. She cooled it the way water does when it settles in a long trough, quiet and useful. Once a year she came to Colt's place on the night the wind turned mean. An evening the grass learned to lay flat and the sky went the color of a bruise. She set a pair of new boots on the porch boards under the cup, small at first, then not so small as the years piled. She never said who they were for, and it didn't matter. There is always a child coming out of weather, feet wet and wrong-sized for what's ahead. When the boots were needed, they fit. Once a spring, a boy you wouldn't have bet on walked out of the greasewood with his chin held together by stubborn. Colt washed him and fed him and sat him with his back to the stove and let him be. Talk comes when heat has worked its way through the cold. Another winter, a woman with a shawl stiff as a board brought her father's old wound to be seen. June set it straight, and Taya translated the sound a man makes when pride steps aside to let sense in. A summer of grasshoppers and fire brought 3 families over the creek with more smoke in their lungs than bread in their sacks. The cup swung, the pot boiled, hands found work, and by moonrise the yard sounded like it should again. Greyhawk's hair went from iron to frost. His eyes didn't get softer, and they didn't have to. They learned instead to stop where they meant to and to forgive without asking permission. Now and then Red Lance rode up alone, left his lance leaned against the gate like a tall stick, and took his coffee from the tin with the exactness of a man who keeps a post. He never stayed long. He never left without touching 2 fingers to the post where the cup hung, a keeper's salute to the thing he kept. The picture on the shelf didn't fade so much as melt into the light of the room, the way good faces do when a house wraps itself around them. Colt replaced the ring of dried grass when Sundays came, as steady as he'd set a fence stay. Some years the grass was greener, some years brittle as tinder. He never failed it, and it never failed him back. On a late afternoon lit sideways with dust hanging so fine you could see it lift and settle and lift again like breath, Colt sat the porch step and watched the field take light like a new coat of paint. The cup moved a thumb's width on its nail and tapped once. Taya's horse made the yard longer again. She tied off at the post the way she always did and set her hat where shade had already found it. She didn't say much right off. She stood, hands on the rail, looking at nothing in particular because sometimes you have to let a day take its own last step. Then she turned and said it the way she had the first time she'd found English she trusted. Plain as a board, well planned. "You fed me," she said, "not to reopen a wound, but to weigh a life properly. I kept you." He nodded like a man accepting a bill he'd already paid, and was glad to see settled again. The words that had held him up more nights than rope ever could were still where he could reach them. He let them out slow, the way a kettle pours when you've learned not to splash. "I won't leave." The wind ran its thumb over the yard, and the yucca leaned and righted. Somewhere a calf complained half-hearted, and a cow answered as if to say, "It's all right. The dark is only a blanket." The cottonwood gave one long, hollow breath that sounded like an old house sleeping. Taya picked up the pair of boots she'd set on the boards and placed them closer to the door, under the nail where the cup hung. They were the size of a child who had learned to run but not yet to look back. Evening came proper. The lamp inside found the tintype and gave it a small square of sun saved over from the afternoon. Taya put a hand on the jamb on her way in, the way people bless a place they trust to hold when the weather comes. Colt touched the picture frame and the grass ring and the worn spot on the chair arm, and then set the spoon straight on the table, not because anyone was looking, but because a man keeps faith best with little things. Out on the rim, the last light broke into pieces and went down. The cup moved on its nail and spoke that thin note, the one everyone in 2 counties had learned to hear. It sounded like water poured careful and like a promise kept. Out here on the frontier, mercy can cost a man his life, or it can save a whole town. What do y'all think? Was Colt right to open his door that night? Drop a simple 0 if you'd have done the same, or a 1 if you'd have turned away. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. More Wild West tales are coming, stories that'll stick with you long after the fire dies down.